Welcome to the latest episode of Signal's Continuous Identity Sessions, where we connect the brightest minds in identity with the strategies and real-world approaches that make IAM work better. I'm your, somewhat experienced host at this point, and still generally curious technology, security, even identity nerd, Dustin Avol. And each session, we're sitting down with people who build and manage identity at enterprise scale. These people who've figured out how to eliminate bottlenecks, reduce manual work, and implement automation where it makes sense to actually improve security without slowing down the business. We call them the best of the best. Today, we have one of the best joining us, and we're focused on something that hits close to home for a lot of identity leaders: how to move your team from being seen as the ticket queue that slows things down to being recognized as a strategic business enabler. If you've ever felt like identity team is capable of so much more than access provisioning, but you can't seem to get executive attention or dig out of that hole or get resources to operate strategically, this conversation is for you. We are joined by Kevin Magee, Global Director of Cybersecurity Startups at Microsoft for Startups. Kevin works with Fortune 500 CISOs every week and has a unique perspective on how the best organizations are repositioning their security and identity programs from cost centers to competitive advantages. He's also written extensively about translating technical security work into business outcomes that executives actually care about. For our audience, we'd love to hear your questions and thoughts. Please comment, please send back questions and requests, and we will personally respond to every single one. So let's get to it. Kevin, first of all, thanks for joining me today. Good to see you again. How are you? Where are you? What's new?
So thank you for having me. I guess I'll be your somewhat experienced guest for the day, so we'll be a good pair. So I live in a small town called Brantford, Ontario, Canada, which is just west of Toronto and the home of Wayne Gretzky, if you're a hockey fan. It's a little chilly out today as we go into fall, but wonderful way to wrap up the week, having a great conversation with you today. So thank you for having me.
And before we get into the industry stuff, I will say I am from Southern California. You are currently living in maybe from the greater Toronto area. The World Series is at stake. Are you a Blue Jays fan, and are you paying attention?
So I think the last time we were in the World Series, I was in school in the early 90s. So it's
30 years ago. Yeah.
It's been quite a big deal up here. That's for certain. So hopefully maybe by the time this airs, it'll be resolved one way or the other. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, before we dive in, maybe you can give folks a quick sense of what you're up to, what your role is at Microsoft. What does that mean, and how your experience and purview have really built a view of the industry?
Well, I've been with Microsoft about 8 years, and I joined our incubation organization for Azure, so working on sort of the new product releases and whatnot. And I've always sort of worked in new product launches, new product releases, and one of those new products at the time was security. When I joined Microsoft. So when it graduated to a full product suite, I went along with it and became Chief Security Officer of Microsoft Canada. So I've had a really unique set of experiences. I'm sure we'll get into some of them over the time period, but to be a practitioner, to run sales organizations, to see different points of view and perspectives. But as CSO, I got a chance to really work with the CISOs, the boards of directors, the audit committee chairs, executives on what their needs are for security and how we can best meet them through Microsoft. And in my current role, I've gone back to my roots, to my startups roots, and I work with our startup ecosystem to say, what do we need to do to extend our platform? What do we need to do to enhance our platform? And what are the innovative startups out there that are solving problems at scale? And I think about the purpose of a platform is to make tools and things available for entrepreneurs and creative people to create things that solve unique problems, sometimes that we never even thought of before. So it's fascinating to work now with startups again to say, how are you approaching these problems? What are you seeing different? And how can we accelerate quickly? Because startups can really, capture the moment of what's happening and iterate quickly to solve problems that enterprise customers need. When we combine that with our platform, sort of that trust level that Microsoft provides, it allows enterprise customers that are risk adverse to new things to then adopt innovative solutions for security at scale to solve some of these new problems. So I think it's the best of both worlds. It's a really fun job, and it's a great chance to have discussions like this as well, where maybe we can sort of influence the direction of how organizations think about, including innovation and addressing innovation and securing innovation as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing. And starting off, given that scope of your experience, if we look at identity teams specifically being business or becoming business enablers, I guess I should say, the reality is that most IAM teams I hear from and I talk to are really stuck with access requests or provisioning tickets. And I'm curious if, number one, if you're seeing the same thing, and how did we end up here where it's a cost center? It's not really this strategic positioning mechanism.
I think from the business perspective, so executive leaders that are non-technical, board, the folks that are sort of running the day-to-day business, they really don't sort of think about where it all fits in on security, IT, and whatnot. It's kind of just this lump of folks that that enable what we do kind of approach. And I bet if you asked most executives, maybe, where does identity fit? Is it an IT function? Is it a security function? Is it its own function? Do we even have that function? They may be unaware that it exists. And when we think about the importance of identity, and it's sort of the cornerstone to everything that we do now in the digital world. The fact that we're not on their radar from an identity perspective, that they don't know where we sit in the organization, they're not thinking through. That tells me the disconnect in the business decisions being made, because business decisions create vulnerabilities that are exploited, at the layer 8 level, and we can't solve that with a tech stack. So I think really raising the discussion to where identity should sit, how are risks managed, how do we think about it within the executive levels, is one of the key challenges we have right now in creating technologies and deploying technologies to secure our enterprises as well too. It's that knowledge gap, that understanding gap that the business has of where identity fits that often creates these problems.
And when you speak to Fortune 500 companies, let's say, I know you're working day to day with a lot of startups in the ecosystem, and they're getting exposed to Fortune 500 companies. Obviously, the Microsoft customer base has the biggest companies in the world. And when you're talking about these cybersecurity threats, and I've read and heard you speak about focusing on the archer in some ways, and when you talk about their identity programs, what are the most common complaints you hear from them? How are they perceiving the challenges in identity and access management?
I think a lot of what we were discussing earlier, just it's not on the radar. It's not getting funded. It's not. It's a challenging issue, and often identity is one of those things that, say, different group business units have built their own identity, little clusters or whatnot. And the skill set needed to go around and federate that identity is massive for an executive. It's not a technical problem. Getting multiple divisions to get on the same identity platform can be a major challenge in some organizations. When you make an acquisition of a company and they come in, they may have a different approach to identity. So just, what is identity? Do we have a common understanding of what identity means to our organization? May not exist. So we see a lot of executives just make assumptions of, we have a security team, they've figured it out, but they're probably not giving the direction to the security teams, to the identity teams, to say this is how we should be thinking about risk from an identity perspective, because it probably doesn't occur to most executives that it's something that they need to set that tone or set that risk. And often CISOs struggle in pushing back to say, you can't abdicate that discussion to us. We can't understand how you think about risk or how you want to apply risk or whatnot. And this isn't just with identity, this is all areas of security. But identity, again, because it maybe is a part of IT, maybe part of security, makes it even more ambiguous in where it fits into the risk discussion. So I know this is something that I help CISOs a lot of times, is how do we discuss these challenges, or how do we put them on the radar, or how even just communication strategies can be implemented to raise these up to where the decision should be made, or just make it part of the decision as well.
It's pretty amazing how sometimes just a little communication can help us along a little further. To what extent are you seeing organizations bringing identity and security together under the same leadership, or at least next to one another, or are you seeing that, I guess?
I think much more so. Like I think back to when I started my career on the help desk. Identity was just one of those things, you provision the phone and the PC and the login, right? It was just part of that ticket, as you mentioned earlier. Where now, you really need that identity layer or control plane or whatever paradigm you want to apply to it figured out in order to layer on modern security. And I think we're at that tipping point now where non-human identities could overtake the number of human identities. And
Sure.
I do remember back, and again, I'm dating myself, where we thought identity just meant a human being. And then we started, in Active Directory, probably 2000, maybe late 90s, thinking about adding the identity of devices. And then, of course, that allowed us to think about things like zero trust and whatnot that we wouldn't have been able to do had we not extended the concept of the identity or the, tracking the devices as well, too. But now when we have human beings that have, agentic services that can act on their behalf that aren't human, and maybe we have 10, 20, 30 times the number of new employees that are virtual coming on board. How do we think about those identities, and how do we delegate access to them? And it's going to be a whole new rethink of what we think of identity. And I guess the way I kind of think about it was when I started my career, the person showed up, you saw them, they were in front of you, you could check their ID, you knew who they were. But now our identities are almost like astral projection. How much of your identity as an employee actually lives in the cloud and on the internet? Most of our conversations are like this. They're virtual. Their email. Our identity and how we express ourselves and our consciousness as an employee, for the most part, is actually existing in a digital realm. And now we're going to layer on these agentic services that can act on our behalf. I think identity now becomes even more important than ever. And I start to think about where the gap is. It's really from the person to the perimeter. We've always thought about security from within the perimeter, and we've extended that out to the edge. But the person to the perimeter with things like deep fakes, change of status or whatnot, continuous access. This is going to be the gap that we have to start to think about. How do we manage, and then how do we manage it with AI services as well too? So I think if you're in the identity space, you will not be unemployed for the near future as these challenges start to mount and organizations have to start dealing with them.
Yeah, let's hope not. You mentioned earlier that a bunch of sort of teams or business organizational units or groups are really driving a lot of the identity around themselves. And I mean, even more so for AI, as you were saying, you're getting these specific bespoke use cases that grow beyond a lot of this management in legacy sort of ways of managing it. So it becomes a concern across the business. And you mentioned it earlier about extending a lot of these conversations from the technical details towards the business and business outcomes. So let's talk about that a little bit. What does it actually look like for an identity leader who's preparing to have a conversation with a CFO or a CEO about investments in identity? How do they even get started in order to bridge that gap and tie those investments back to the business and not just to a technical detail or a technical service?
I think it needs to be a discussion that's held, risk, general risk, and identity should be a subsection of that discussion with every major business decision, especially around digital transformation. And I don't know where we're going to call it AI transformation, because we're not, with digital transformation, we're just not, sort of paving the goat trails and calling them highways. We're rethinking the business process, and we're introducing new risk as well. With the AI digital transformation, or whatever we're going to call this, there has to be another rethink of these things. So, for example, a project to enable the sales force to use AI tools to respond to customers. Maybe it's just in their email and whatnot as well too. Well, that's just not a tool you click in or add to email. This is going to completely change the workflow. It's going to completely change accountability. If something goes out in an email to a customer that shouldn't have, it's misworded, or not a proper sentiment that represents the company's values or whatnot, how do we look at who's responsible for that and whatnot? How do we tie that back to the individual? These are questions I think we need to stop and pause and think through as we sort of push these technologies out. And when you talk to boards, they're very interested in cybersecurity, but they're very much more interested in using artificial intelligence to improve efficiencies, to gain market competitiveness and whatnot. So I think if we show up as risk professionals and not just identity professionals, as the the old Mr. No, and when I can't do this, we're always going to be sort of sidelined, or we'll be cleaning up the messes afterwards. So how do we get really engaged and involved in solving those problems and coming forth with solutions early in those project forming processes to say, here's how we think we can do it. And ultimately, employees will want to do their job, and they will find the easiest way to do their job. And then the old days, that was shadow IT, maybe. And if we can make it easy, if we become the easier thing to do within IT, then most people will just conform. So again, rethinking the approach, very positive, very forward thinking, but also reframing sometimes things like privacy, consent, and whatnot in terms of business advantage that we can derive, not just in terms of risk mitigation, because boards executives are all about the upside, and they don't, they'll focus on the downside or the risk as much as they need to, but the business is driven by the upside. So how do we much more align our thinking to that side is really sort of the coaching I do quite often with CISOs in these discussions.
Well, sometimes we sort of revert to what's getting measured is what's getting managed, I guess. And these teams might care a lot about tracking their users provisioned or tickets closed, which is tough to really tie to business impact. So how do you respond to those requests or those questions about what they should be tracking? What are the metrics that you can show that you're mitigating risk? It can be kind of an esoteric thing. So I'm curious how identity teams can really be tracking these metrics that executives actually care about.
So it's interesting. So you go to an audit committee meeting and you hear the financial folks, and they go through, and there's 200 years of generally accepted accounting principles that talk about controls and whatnot, and so you would never allow the person who receives invoices to pay invoices. You'd have a control and whatnot in those. We've got that all figured out, and then I hear things like, well, protect the crown jewels. We're doing that. Yep. Okay. And we go into the controls discussion for IT. Well, if you haven't classified your data, how do we know what the crown jewels are? If we talk about things like identity controls, often the auditors are coming back and saying they're lacking, and quite often when I go back to the next quarter's audit committee, they're still lacking, and there's a disconnect in sometimes the importance of these. They're just IT things. Well, they're just as important as the checking account kind of thing. But often I think what happens is the executives don't understand what they're being asked to do. So reframing sort of the approach from our side is key, because I'll ask, well, give me a metric I can track thing. And I hear organizations tracking things like number of email accounts compromised, or just very operational metrics. Well, we're certainly not, in the chief financial officer's report, there's not how many checks we wrote last month, because it's immaterial to the amount of fraud. So how do we start to think about explaining risk? And I like Rick Howard's approach. If you've anyone's read his book First Principles, chapter 6 talks about what's the probability of a material impact to the organization due to a cyber event over the next 3 years. So framing a discussion to say, with this project moving forward, I see a 40 to 60% probability of a $8 to $10 million impact if we don't properly provision identity with this solution. Now business people can understand that. Giving ranges, is kind of the key. When it doesn't have to be scientific. You can use inside out Bayesian approach or whatnot, but really you're just sort of expressing the level of concern they need to think about. And then that allows the business folks to say, okay, hey, this is material. We should look at this. And if you think it's maybe a 10%, I mean, a 10 to 20% chance of $100,000 material impact should something go wrong, but the upside of this project is 20 million, then they may decide that we're not going to invest in risk mitigation for this project. But that's their decision from the business perspective to accept that risk. That's not up to us in technology to accept those risks. So one, we need a better way to communicate, and probability ranges and dollar amounts are probably the best way to do it. And then we need to make sure that we're not letting the business folks abdicate their responsibility to understand the risk, ask questions. Because at that point, if they don't understand, well, why is it a 60 to 80% probability? This could happen. Okay, let me walk you through that. Well, now they've asked the question. So we're actually answering their question. We're educating and informing them rather than just sort of throwing data at them. So some of those communication techniques on how to engage the exec are really the difference between getting your program funded or you really getting maybe fired when their program that you didn't fund your security measures results in a material impact to the organization. So, and it's not a skill that we teach in technology. We often promote the technological folks up the ladder because of their ability to do the technological things, not necessarily the people things. So I'm a big advocate of investing in leadership training, education for cybersecurity professionals in general, for this main purpose, to have these discussions and to sort of better assert our positions within these discussions, but also position them very positively instead of negatively.
That's great. A quick follow-up on some of the metrics. I think compliance is maybe one of those more binary measurements, right? It's you're either compliant or you're not, or maybe not, but generally. And I believe you've stated, or you've mentioned in an article, that compliance can really be a competitive advantage, not just a burden. I'm sure that compliance is something that boards are discussing and care about. How does this play into identity programs, risk, all those other metrics that we've been discussing?
I think the purpose of compliance, and I think back to my earliest days, I kind of saw compliance as you have to cross the road between the lines. That was compliance. It's an arbitrary rule. So if I had to walk 2 blocks down to cross the road in the lines to be compliant, that was fine. But if no one's watching and whatnot, I could jaywalk across as long as I looked both ways so I don't get hit by a truck. That was security. Yeah. That's what I was really about. But as I've sort of taken on more responsibility, and I work a lot with boards of directors, sit on a number of boards of public institutions and whatnot. The purpose of compliance is good. I think, the understanding that, these are things we need to do because it makes the organization safe and trustworthy. The implementation doesn't always work to match the importance of the compliance. So when we make it really onerous, the compliance, and it's once every 2 years, and it's so out of date, really it's that information doesn't help the organization run the business. But with modern technology and tooling, what if we could continuously test the level of our compliance, and we could start to see if we're drifting off course? That could inform our business decision rather than hearing about it 18 months from now that 2 years ago we missed compliance in an area. So that allows us to make real-time decisions, informed decisions on risk, but then also say, yes, we're confident moving into sort of this new geographical area with our sales team and opening up a new sales office because we have this in place and we can run continuous checks. Or if we acquire another company, we can sort of spread our umbrella of compliance over for continuous monitoring. And you even see this in the sort of the health hacking phase, like how many of us are now wearing Apple Watches or Whoops or whatnot, where we're continuously monitoring and we're making better decisions about even our own health. Because I know if I go to the doctor's in 2 years and I get my blood taken and my blood sugar's a little high, he's going to yell at me, and for the next couple months I'll stop eating ice cream. But if I can in real time see, wow, that's what having that ice cream cone at 8 o'clock did to my blood sugar, I should probably have an apple instead. right? So it's the same thing
Yeah.
applied to business. What if we could start to think about the health of the business, the way we're using the health monitors within our organization? So, and that applies to all areas of security, and I think especially to identity being sort of the bedrock of security.
Yeah, and I mean at Signal we talk a lot about context of access, right, and security, a part of that, and other states of being as parts of that as well that might not always be considered direct identity or security considerations, but a ticket status is context. It could be that the blood sugar reading that really leads you to thinking about the decision you're making and how to make it in the future and how you've made it in the past.
And
That's a really
data at the
interesting.
time of the decision too, right? I think that's the
Yeah,
key, like up-to-date data at the time of the decision. And I think that's what we're
right.
getting to in that capability we're having now.
Yeah, when things change, then I said in an earlier episode, I think there's this idea that you never cross the same river twice, because even if you're crossing in that same spot, that the river's different, the water's rushed by, all those different pieces. It's to your point, that real time context to make the decision at the appropriate time.
And I may enter into a task, and I've escalated my privileges, done the proper
Hmm.
thing. I'm not logged in as administrator. I've logged in as myself, and now I've logged in as administrator, escalated my privileges to do a task, but then I get off doing something else, and forget to downgrade my own privileges. Well, if I'm running some agentic software or whatnot that has access to my privileges, it's creating new opportunities for attackers to think about, how we can leverage those gaps. So I think even more so now, we can't rely on sort of the human in the loop to take care of those challenges. So the approaches, that you're working on and that I see are most effective are those areas where it can just sort of happen on its own, where it, continuous monitoring is really looking at what is the privileges needed at the time, what makes sense. And again, we've been doing this for years. If you're having a plumber over, to work on your house, you don't give them the key to the house and your alarm code and say, come whenever. When they
Right.
show up, they have access. Well, they do their job and they leave. You're not going to give them sort of that continuous access as well, too. So we've applied those principles to IT, and I think they've worked well for now. But now the plumber doesn't just show up on his own. Millions of nano robots show up as well too in the form of agentic solutions. How do we think about their identity? How do we think about their access? What do they have access to? And I see this in some of the AI deployments we're having, where we'll say, well, this information was leaked out, because we deployed this AI tool. Well, no, actually, it was always available. It was just hard to find, right?
Right.
And often it's an identity issue where, it's been shared to everyone or shared to a group or shared to someone who shouldn't have access to it or whatnot. So it's these tools are surfacing problems that have existed for quite a while, but they're just more visible now because we're implementing these tools that surface them faster. So we can either take advantage of that to sort of rethink how we deploy security, things like identity, or we suffer the consequences if we move too quickly with these tools without balancing the risk associated with them.
Yeah, I think we're skirting around, but discussing zero standing privilege. And I know you've written about zero standing privilege and ZSP being a real shift from perpetual access to this purpose-driven security. But we realize that it's not just flipping a switch of zero standing privilege because of all the components that it touches, and we've talked about, from IT ops to business workflows. When you talk to organizations about these challenges that are across departments, where are the biggest friction points? How do you sequence the work across the teams in order to get to that model?
I think really, consensus of what identity is, what it means to the organization, and sometimes starting with the philosophical question is a great place, because it surfaces misunderstandings or different interpretations of what should we be looking at. And I even look at this from, say, the privacy perspective. If we're collecting consent to send me information within the state of California, does that imply consent when I'm overseas to send it to, or to me as well too? So we have so many factors that contribute to identity. What does that really mean to the organization? I think post COVID too, when we're having discussions like this, we often engage with our peers more often via digital means. So when you're on a virtual call, how are you sure that that's the person that you thought it was? And I think about sort of the application process. So when job hunters would sort of send in the application, you could sort of read and get a sense of them, and they kind of matched how they sounded on the video conference. But now they're using ChatGPT and other tools to write their cover lists and resumes, and they sound like PhD experts. And then you sometimes get on, and maybe the cover letter resume didn't match, but you can tell. But what happens when the cover letter and the person you're talking to on screen are both AI generated, and you have no means of checking that? This isn't something that HR departments have ever had to deal with before. It's really happened in a matter of months. Some of these technologies have become available. So, long held views of how did I know that was the person that I was talking to? How did I engage in those discussions? That we've just held these beliefs. Now we're seeing some of these challenges that are so unique to organizations that have never had to think about it before as well too. So bringing other organizations into the discussion and say, sir, what challenges are you having?
Okay, did have a little bit of a technical difficulty here, but that's life. That's what we're dealing with. And coincidentally, Kevin, I wanted to ask you about something we've been calling the pyramid of pain. That wasn't too painful, and there's an interesting pain pyramid, we've called it. That's a parallel in threat detection. You could say that some sort of defensive controls are trivial for attackers to bypass. When we think about it in a workforce environment, I usually think about it from an application mission criticality. When we're talking about zero standing privileges with regards to it, how concerned are we the standing privilege that a user has to Microsoft Teams or Slack or even email versus a cloud workload in Azure or in AWS or GCP, for instance? Obviously, those are different levels of real time, different levels of mission criticality should something bad happen for an attacker to bypass. How do you think about sort of zero standing privilege through that lens? And how can identity leaders move to those approaches of zero standing privilege in that pyramid approach? Where do they start? What resistance do they get in an organization? It's a little bit of a, one size does not fit all. So how can they move to that with least resistance to eliminate standing privileges?
I think when we think about it, again, the question asks, how do we decide, what is most important? That's the conversation really the business has to decide. Ultimately, the business has to instruct us on what its risk tolerance is. Is it going to accept risk? Is it going to mitigate risk? Because we might deem one application not to be, too important, but it can turn out to be the either the entry point to the larger attack, or maybe it includes some information that is very important. So we often see third-party applications being used. So say you're having an event, and you spin up an event application. Well, that's outside of your identity solution, your current identity solution. Well, that could be the breach that result in password reuse or information as well too. So, but that was a third-party application, but it's still an employee doing work, so it needs to be brought into the identity fold. The classic one, and I don't see as often, was, well, we've constructed this incredible identity, management solution. We've locked down, the organization, but then we have external board members that are using their personal Hotmail accounts. We're going to send the most confidential information, part of the company, to board members via their Gmail account or something like that as well. So we break those rules. So often really having those discussions with the business. Are you comfortable about sending board package material to a Gmail account? Is in violation of sort of all of our identity principles, right? And I don't think it often occurs to business people that that's a problem until you sort of walk them through it. Well, if it was in our environment, we would know who has access to it and whatnot. And then things like, well, we'll throw it up on a SharePoint portal. Well, if I'm on this committee of the board, I have access to the in-camera minutes of that committee meetings. But if I leave that committee, then I no longer have it. But if it's all on one general SharePoint, then I would have access to those information. So I think, often we just assume that business people, think through these challenges, and business people just assume that we're taking care of those things. And that's where the disconnect happens, where some of this data maybe leaks out. Teams has a sort of a SharePoint backend where files, when you put it in the chat, are stored. Who has access to that chat afterwards? If we just add someone to a standing meeting that we have, will they have access to the files? Will they have access to the chat? That's a daily occurrence where we don't have those deep discussions. Well, if we're not doing that in sort of the day-to-day communications and operations, what are we thinking about our back office? How are we thinking about how those communication things work as well? Throughout the organization. So I think there's this assumption on both sides that the other side's figured it out or has it taken care of, and often we need to step through the actual sort of use cases with the business to say, have you thought through this? What other areas where should we be thinking about identity? The one that I find now is interesting with board meetings is now not only do we have people joining from their own personal accounts to a Zoom, to a Teams, but they're sending their own personal AI note takers to a board meeting to transcribe the meeting. If you walked in to a company meeting with a tape recorder and sat it down on the desk and hit record 10 years ago, I think it would get a different response. But I often see some board members just admitting these 5 or 6 note takers. So I'm worried some of these things we're normalizing without really thinking through the ramifications of what is that thing? How do we know the actual board member sent that? How is that information going to be used? Like we need to stop and sort of have some of these discussions. A lot of these tools are really making us more efficient, but with that comes some risk as well too.
How do you advise to the CISOs or the security leaders or whoever it is to be able to better communicate those risks in business terms? Is it through, obvious sort of stories like the one you just gave about the tape recorder, or how can these leaders think about framing work to executives who maybe don't care or just don't know about protocols or architecture or the technical nature of things?
I think it's basically using metaphor, using storytelling. So you don't pass out power tools to your kindergarten age children and say, that it makes them more efficient though. They can drill holes faster and whatnot. But that's really what we're doing sometimes, is passing out these really incredible, powerful tools without thinking, does that person have the knowledge? Do they, are we giving it to the right person? I think sometimes just slowing down and stopping and having those conversations, but then expressing it in ways that they can understand, because we often will express it as technical people in technical frameworks and terms, which they don't get, and they will just shut off if they start to understand. The opposite of that is, when the business people get really wound up about something, and they'll say, well, this AI thing, it's, I saw the Terminator, and it's a very emotional type question. Yeah. And as we're technical people, we respond with data. Well, if someone's using system one thinking fear and you respond with data, you're at a different disconnect. So you really need to say, okay, are they emotionally having a discussion, or are they ready to have that discussion? So sometimes, just aligning your answer to the state of mind that they're in, to say, and to stop and say, well, I don't know how the movie Terminator applies to this situation. Can you walk me through that? Can just be a way to sort of slow down and reframe the conversation. But because we're technical folks and often they're the business, we feel compelled to answer. And what do we answer with? We answer with data, we answer with technical answers, we answer with frameworks, which confuses them. And then there's even more of a disconnect in conversation. So stop slowing down, making sure that you understand the question, not abdicating responsibility. These are very difficult things for technical people to do, but these are the most important discussions we need to have. And it's going to be even more difficult as we struggle to understand the technology. And I have to admit, most of my security career, I just watch packets on the network. It's a whole new world out there, and there's whole new aspects to security that I could never have imagined even a year ago that we are dealing with today. So it's okay not to know all the answers and to have these philosophical discussions. But I think getting, to an understanding of what the challenges are, what the opportunities are together is sort of key. And things, identity is at that root. What constitutes an identity? What constitutes a person? What constitutes a privilege? Like, these are things that are being completely rewritten now, and we need to have these conversations with the business and be on the same page with them.
It sounds like, some serious cultural change, not just like better dashboards, and Skynet notwithstanding. It's some basic communication, and we've started this episode talking a lot about identity teams and identity security getting a real business seat at the table, or a seat at the business table, maybe better said. It sounds like it may boil down to a little bit of listening and learning and communicating better, and not just in the ones and zeros always. I think that's what I'm hearing from you mostly.
And if you think about some of the attacks, like we're seeing sort of the executive impersonation, for a check and whatnot, these are all just confidence scams that have been around forever, right? But they're accelerated and more difficult to identify because of the technology that's obscuring the identity further as well too. So as these are sort of surfacing, and we see the videos, the fake videos of someone doing whatnot, or they're starting to get a sense of what the challenges are. But when I think we're struggling to understand how the technology works, how it fits in, how it's going to be deployed, and just the speed that it's happening, they must be struggling too. So I think we need to be comfortable and confident to admit, we don't know, we don't have all the answers. Maybe before we launch that thing, we need to slow down, because I don't know what you want, and if I don't know what you want, I don't know how we can protect the organization. I think that's a fair thing to say. So we need to be comfortable and confident in having those discussions, because again, we can't just check their driver's license when they show up at the door anymore, or sign in, sign the employee in and put the badge around them and what like that. We have had sort of this idea of how we manage access that really hasn't changed that fundamentally over years, that is going to change drastically in the future. And we have the opportunity today to set sort of that fundamental approach or culture. I think that will be key. Those organizations that really invest in it now and get it right will accelerate with these technologies. Those customers that don't, or those organizations that don't think about it, that don't invest, are going to be hampered as they sort of run into roadblocks with these challenges and either have to retrofit. They're just going to lose ground to their competitors who are racing forward with some of these technologies. So often, my grandfather, who was a carpenter, says you measure twice and you cut once. I think this is our opportunity with things like, what is an identity? How are we going to secure it? How are we going to approach it? Let's measure, twice before we cut once. And that's how we become a business accelerant.
Great stuff. I mean, slow down to speed up. I have another friend who is a craftsman as well, and he says slow is smooth and smooth is fast. If you get going too fast, then you end up having to stop and go back. But slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I have heard, obviously, throughout this, you've been talking about AI. How can we not today or any day? And Microsoft is clearly in the middle of a lot of the AI agent work and automation, and with Copilot. And while I understand you are not the AI spokesperson for Microsoft, I'm curious about how you see AI automating identity work. What's realistic? What's still going to require a lot of this human judgment and strategic thinking?
Wow, that's a pretty open-ended question. I gotta say, I initially struggled to understand what the big deal was about AI, which is probably counterintuitive. But I think, again, because most of my peers were explaining it to me in technological terms, and I really didn't start to understand until I started to use it to myself and for my own tasks and purposes. And I think that's when sort of the lights came on. And for what part of Microsoft culture is, we want to be using our own tools. So, are we using Copilot to respond to emails? Are we using Copilot to do summarizing, when we come back for vacation and whatnot? And I was quite nervous to have it do some things for me on my behalf. But as I've become more comfortable with the tool, I start to imagine things that it can do for me, and I just overall get more comfortable with the tools. But I think back to when we started to be able to share our screen, I was always worried about sharing something I shouldn't, or when you could share a file in OneDrive. Well, what if I get the permissions wrong? I think I'm having some of that anxiety now. If I'm creating something that's going to make my life easier, am I inadvertently opening the door to allowing someone access to something that they shouldn't have? So I think tying some of the AI stuff to what you do personally is key, and executives need to do that too. They need to experience the tools, not just sort of abdicate that as well too, and then start to think through, okay, what are the ramifications, of these actions that I'm doing? Will give us a better sense as well too. But it's an interesting time to sort of engage with the business to say, well, how do you want to use the tools? How can we help you? What are your top tasks? How can we, make them more secure? How do we think about this? If you're going to run some of these agents, how risky is this? What data will they have access to? Asking open-ended questions like that, I think, are really going to be key. And again, from a communication perspective, why is a challenging question to ask. Why are you doing that? Why is very accusational. So I always encourage IT folks, always ask how or what. How or what questions are curiosity. They're engaging, they're sharing. A why can be interpreted from the business of as adversarial or accusational. So if you ask, why are you doing that? It's a very different than, well, what are you going to use that for, and how will that work and improve your day? Same question, just framed very differently. So often we don't, in the tech folks, don't think about the niceties of those words, but it's very powerful in how we position ourselves, because what questions position us as curious, as an advocate, as someone that's there to help them, but also sort of puts them in the driver's seat to answer why can really create that adversational, distance between the organizations that we're trying to avoid too. So be very cautious of not just what you're asking, but how you're asking and how you're engaging. Is a lot of the advice I provide to CISOs and executives with the business as well, because a few words like that can really change, the level of engagement.
Wow, great takeaway there, not just for the topic we had today. And speaking of, as we start to wrap up with our guest, Kevin Magee, the Global Director for Cybersecurity Startups at Microsoft for Startups. Kevin, if an IAM leader or a director, whatever it may be, listened, watched this today, where would you advise that they really focus on spending their time and energy over the next year to maximize team impact? Or maybe if we had to boil it down, what's like one thing you would tell them to take away from this talk today?
I think the biggest skill we can have is risk professionals. I'll just lump risk professionals together. Is to be able to communicate risk better. And there's two ways to do that. One is how I said, sort of verbally position it. So thinking about your layer 8 skills of executive presentation and communication, but also the ability to quantify things really matters. So if you can express yourself in sort of a way that communicates the way they want to listen on the business side, but then you can bring numbers to the discussion. I think that's key, because when we don't quantify things, there's no way for them to calibrate the importance of the challenge. So really think about, how do I approach that? So which means, understanding, how do I quantify risk? How do I do Bayesian analysis kind of thing? You don't have to become a stats major, but there's wonderful books, out there, or wonderful, lessons that you can take from other risk organizations about how to communicate that will allow your message to be landed with the gravity that you need it to be. So you can't just say it's a big problem. Well, what's the magnitude of the problem? Because you might think a $100,000 material risk is, a huge thing, but maybe to the folks you're talking to, it's, who are dealing in billions of dollars, well, I'm willing to accept a $100,000 risk. So, so calibrating, so in quantification is sort of the key. And if here's the sort of the final note on that, if you can't quantify it, how do you expect them to be able to quantify it? So that puts the burden on us to understand, we need to quantify the risk. We need to quantify the challenge in order to communicate. And ranges are great, because I've had a number of times where someone, senior execs come back, well, where did you get that opinion from? Well, it's my opinion, and this is my informed opinion, and this is the range I think it is. If you want more, I can drill down to that, but I think a 30-40% range from my outside-inside analysis, is effective enough to have this discussion. Generally, I hear then good enough, right? But again, if you can't quantify it, we can't expect them to quantify it. And that's really the key to landing any message that's going to influence an executive as well too. So those soft skills really do matter, and engaging in those conversations, those idea based conversations about how we can improve the business, not just how we can secure the business, is going to engage them and get them wanting to talk to you, instead of sort of rolling their eyes or being unavailable when you show up on their calendar as well too.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, great advice. And a couple more quick hits before we let you get out of here. Speaking of getting out of here, where are you going next? Where will you be? I know you travel a bit. I know that Microsoft Ignite is coming up. Where can folks run into you or see and hear you speak?
Well, I'm traveling. It's conference month, October, November. So I'll be traveling quite a bit. I'll be in Washington attending the Data Tribe conference, which is always a great one. Ignite is our conference, so I just tens of thousands of people. I don't know the size of it, but it's a great opportunity to engage in all sorts of discussions about what's going on at Microsoft and our ecosystem. And this year it's in San Francisco. I think that's in 3 weeks from now, from the time we're taping. But it is a very busy time to really to sort of capture and understand what's going on in the marketplace. So I'm prioritizing spending face-to-face time, really sort of a deeper discussion. So not 30-minute hits, 1 hour hits, 2 hour hits with some of the portfolio companies we're working with, to really understand the challenges, and with customers as well too. A great opportunity to engage and say, what are your challenges? How can we help? And those are some of the most interesting conversations I have when I talk to customers and say, what are the challenges? I have these discussions, and we have an opportunity to bring back to the business then through my organization and say, here's what we're seeing. Are we building a product? Can we partner with a startup that's building innovation? Or should we, talk to some startups that say, hey, here's something completely new we hadn't thought of. Can you help us build it? So it's an exciting time from that perspective, from a builder's perspective, because there's so much happening. There's so much opportunity to make a contribution right now. And the tools and platform are just going to increase and get better and become more complex, which will then require more, more thinking, more tooling, more developing as well too. So I think it's important we stay vigilant as defenders, but I think it's important that we stay aligned to the business and making ourselves the enablers of these technologies. So I think you'll see the theme through anything I write or speak about is how do we become an enabler of these solutions rather than get in their way. Throughout my career, when we've tried to stop things like BYOD or whatnot, it's never ended well for us in IT. So I think this is our opportunity to do it right this time.
Great. Well, we like to ask each guest we have on continuous identity sessions a similar question around in the spirit of continuously evolving. So I put it to you, Kevin, what's something that you continuously work on, continuously attempt to do, continuously practice? Definitely doesn't have to be work related. It could be a personal skill or something you're interested in.
Well, as you might have guessed, I'm a big reader. So that's obviously I read about a book a week, and I read very
Wow.
broadly across history, psychology, whatnot. I find bringing in other aspects are really key. I think the one thing that was challenged, and a friend of mine who's an English professor challenged me a couple of years ago, was that for most of my career I've read nonfiction, and I've been struggling with some of these new technologies, and he's challenged me to go back to science fiction to sort of understand how AI is going to affect humanity, what those technologies will be like, because there's a whole genre there that's been studying these challenges for years. So I think reading broadly
Yeah.
is the key to help influence my thinking, and it's also sort of a way for me to unwind at the end of the day. But I also can't tell you how often I connect with an executive or someone over a book that we've both enjoyed. So, or a common thing we've learned from a book or whatnot. So, people like to connect on ideas, and people like to
Yeah.
explore those ideas. And the number one thing I often get asked for people who have worked with me for a number of years, well, what are you reading now? And what's kind of interesting is one of the things I like to ask as well too. So I think we can get hyper focused on just learning AI or just learning our security, but I think the bringing in a broader parts of the discussion from quantification, from our business colleagues, or understanding how psychology works in terms of asking questions or whatnot. Reading broadly is probably the best thing I've done for my career to enhance it, and also it's just quite a great way for introverts like myself to make connections with people that have similar interests as well too. So that would be my answer, I think, in a convoluted way to your question.
Oh, great. No, it's perfect. Thank you, Kevin. Thanks again for joining us. And we're very grateful for you taking time out of your day. And thanks to everyone who joined us here today and also who's joining us in the future, I guess. Quick reminder, all of these continuous identity sessions are recorded and available at signal.ai and our YouTube channel. We're continuously developing our on-demand library, I should say, over here at Signal Continuous Identity Sessions. You can also subscribe at signal.ai to get details on all upcoming episodes. We'll also share links to resources or articles or maybe books that Kevin mentioned in the follow-up email if you subscribe. Next time, same channels, next level insights. Continuous identity session is coming soon. Until then, keep making identity work better and more continuous. We'll see you next time.